Okay, so I'm David Lax. I'm the co-founder and managing principal of Lax Sibelius LLC, and I'm delighted that you've chosen to join us for the third in our series of 3 webinars on social media and negotiation. Now, many of you, but not all of you, will know about Lax Sibelius. We're a consulting firm that works as an advisor to companies and governments in complex and high-stake negotiations. We build our company's capabilities as organizations to get better results consistently in certain classes of negotiations. A lot of that, our advisory work and our capability building are based on an approach that Jim Sibelius and I developed called 3D negotiation, which we did going back and forth between work on Wall Street in diplomatic settings and as advisors and as professors at Harvard Business School. What I will say here is that that approach, which is I think the most sophisticated available for complex negotiations, has delivered hundreds of millions to billions of dollars of benefit to clients around the world. And what we're seeing here is an important way to extend that. The premise of these webinars is that digital media has disrupted everything about business. We see digital media disrupting marketing, sales, business strategy, procurement, learning and development, customer service, government relations. But based on what we see from our clients in terms of the negotiations they're doing, and from what we see being written by negotiation academics and professionals, is digital media has not yet disrupted how people are thinking about negotiation strategy, even though social media has in fact disrupted many negotiations. So the purpose of this session is to continue to share with you what we think is a really important development, which is to extend 3D negotiation using the tools and approaches that are available in social media. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Jim Sibelius, who'll give you something of a recap and an overview.
Dave, thanks very much. I'm delighted that people can join us today. I'm Jim Sibelius, professor at Harvard Business School and co-founder of Lax Sibelius. And it's my pleasure to launch into the substance of what we'll be doing before we get into the specific case itself. And really what we're going to be doing and what we're looking at is the result of having tried to figure out how social media can and should affect negotiations. And we, as I have detailed in earlier webinars, neither scholars nor experienced practitioners really have a good handle on this. And so as a result, we put together a panel of really fine academics and senior practitioners on this topic of social media and negotiation at a recent Harvard research conference. And that has provided the intellectual capital behind the diagnostic and prescriptive aspects we've been developing on social media. And we presented in parts 1 and 2 of this webinar series some of those findings. Now, I'm going to give you a very brief recap of those two webinars in order that you can see our structure here today. We're really extending in a very different direction today from the places that we visited before. So our first webinar was really involved Amazon in New York City, and it involved how a small band of digerati using social media formed a largely unopposed hostile blocking coalition that ended up derailing Amazon's plans for a New York headquarters. And that was despite ardent support by Governor Cuomo, Mayor de Blasio, and an astonishing 70% of the city's residents. We showed how digital tools, and I showed you one of the graphs that we presented here, and open source data from social media could have helped Amazon learn about and influence events before and in real time during the process, including identifying parties that had almost no obvious interest in this project, like immigration rights activists, that ended up having really major effects on the outcome. And of course, it's not enough to diagnose the issue. The question is, what do you do about it? And we believe that we designed a social media driven strategy that could have mobilized supporters and neutralized opponents in the interest of producing a negotiated outcome that we think would have been great for virtually all stakeholders. Well, that was the first of the webinars. The second was how using a mere blog could fend off a very powerful union. And we looked at the organizing efforts of a major union to a Boston medical center that was just emerging from a deep financial crisis via what they called a corporate campaign. And that was designed to damage its relations with patients, doctors, nurses, staff, board, donors, politicians, and media, plus launch regulatory and legal attacks in a way that would strengthen their position dramatically at the bargaining table. We showed how its CEO in advance had invested heavily in a blog, built up an extensive audience among the hospital's internal and external stakeholders on a range of issues, of course, having nothing to do to that point with the campaign, and beforehand developed high credibility through a policy of radical transparency about potentially sensitive issues like his own compensation. Threatened with this damaging campaign, he did several things. He investigated the union's likely playbook and used his blog to inform health reporters and other stakeholders in advance, inoculating them against aggressive tactics, disinformation, and surprise influence. And as the campaign progressed, he used this digital tool to mobilize supporters, and again, by anticipating and preempting union moves, was able to neutralize potential opponents. And he did so by consistently grounding his actions in appealing values: free discussion by all sides, democratic union elections without intimidation by anyone. So that was the second of these webinars. And our third webinar really takes a different tack, and it explores the role of social media for the type of negotiation, the setting, the kind of organization, the social media platforms, and analytic tools differ from the first two. In a nutshell, the first webinar showed how a global company in a huge city in a politically charged negotiation that drew international attention, which we analyzed by Twitter and network visualization techniques. The second, a medium-sized hospital in a tough union organizing negotiation in a major city, which we analyzed in terms of the growth and use of a simple blog. And today, we're going to look at an early stage company in a small town negotiating potential bankruptcy from a local controversy. And here, we're going to analyze it using Facebook, Instagram, and several different analytical mapping tools. So really, in almost all dimensions, we're covering a pretty wide range through through a deeper exploration of these three cases. Now, what I want to do is place these three specific cases into a bigger intellectual picture, and show you how they fit into that. What we've established and what we've learned is that many social media platforms exist, lots of general tools to analyze this data, but for the most part, not yet customized to meet the needs of sophisticated negotiators. And as David mentioned, 3D negotiation turns out to be uniquely well suited to take advantage of these new tools and open source information, in part because we show how moves away from the table to set up the most promising possible situation are often the keys to success. And as a core part of an integrated 3D negotiation strategy, properly analyzed social media information can turbocharge such moves to help you achieve your target goal. Now, how you do that is, and how a 3D negotiation strategy can be enhanced is 4 ways that I'm going to very briefly elaborate: to learn, influence, mobilize, and neutralize to help you reach your target deal. And we want to underscore the importance of ethical and privacy concerns in the use of these potentially abusive tools. So, in a little bit more detail, we see how social media in the first of these functions can help you explore and learn much more about the parties to a negotiation, from your immediate counterparts to others away from the table, who they are actually and potentially, who's directly and indirectly influential, what are their interests, what are their no-deal options, their relationships, formal and informal, and possible coalitions. So it's a tool to help you learn. It's a tool of effective influence directly, how to anticipate their likely points, frame messages that'll resonate, and avoid those that'll backfire. And indirectly, to communicate via other respected sources that can sway the more directly involved parties. And finally, to mobilize potential supporters and/or deter and neutralize potential opponents. Now, with this bigger picture in mind, we're going to turn to the specifics of our third case. And now I want to turn this over to my friend and colleague, Ben Cook.
Hi, my name is Ben Cook, and I'm Vice President of Lax Sabanius LLC, a firm that advises companies and governments in complex negotiations, as well as the founder of Red Pill Strategies, a boutique strategy shop focused on helping organizations navigate the many high-stakes challenges they face operating in today's 24/7 digital jungle. For today's webinar, what I'd like you all to keep in mind is that we're really dealing with something revolutionary. Like David said just a minute ago, digital media has disrupted everything about our world. But if we look around, too many businesses today are stuck in this outdated mindset where they view social media as just another channel for their existing strategies. But the internet is not merely a new medium. It creates entirely new capabilities and paradigms, and that's what makes it so disruptive in field after field. But because embracing this change requires developing entirely new strategies that are native to the digital age, its transformative impact on negotiations has gone largely untapped. And so many negotiators these days are lined up like the British in the Revolutionary War, very well funded, very sharp uniforms, but with giant targets painted on their chests. In our previous webinars, we've told you some about how to play defense in this new area. Today, we're going to be getting very practical about how businesses of any size facing any number of challenges can make use of some of these paradigm-changing shifts to gain crucial advantages in their most important negotiations. But first, a quick note before we dive in. As Professor Sabanius mentioned just a second ago, one of the crucial things to keep in mind as we walk through this case today is the ethical considerations inherent in doing this kind of analysis, particularly around privacy. Now, in this instance, all of the details have already been made public, and we've spoken with several of the key players to get their consent to share their information. But out of an overabundance of caution, we're also taking this proactive step of blinding all the names, identifying details, and even the faces of the individuals we've analyzed. So in this webinar, I'll be walking you through a blinded case study in how businesses can use open source information available publicly on the internet to gain or mitigate against information asymmetries in their negotiations. Our case study focuses on the man you see here, who we'll call Adam Kingston. We'll be discussing his company, a legal cannabis business we'll refer to as Canna Productions, and their experience negotiating with the disguised town of Old Haven, Massachusetts. So I'll start by giving a quick background before spending the majority of our time talking about the specific findings we've uncovered using open source social media intelligence. So Adam Kingston is an entrepreneur who capitalized on the medical marijuana market to build a $10 million production facility in the town of Old Haven, Massachusetts, where he was a quiet corporate citizen for several years. But when the state unexpectedly legalized recreational marijuana, a provision of that legislation allowed municipalities to ban pot businesses by referendum. And in Old Haven, a local mom began a grassroots campaign to try and bar legal cannabis from the town. Now, this initially targeted only retail establishments, but it was later expanded through a somewhat underhanded, secretive process to include Adam Kingston's existing production facility as well. This posed an existential threat to his business, and so he hired a well-regarded, rather famous outside firm to mount an aggressive campaign to try and persuade the town not to outlaw his business. You can see here a mailer that they sent out accusing the town of doing something fishy with the referendum. It looks like standard PR tactics, but this was received incredibly poorly. Old Haven is a small, tight-knit, family values type town, and this mailer was seen as overly slick, too aggressive, and totally out of step with the community. There's an asymmetry here. The anti-pot activists knew their community intimately, but the seemingly tried and true tactics from these outside experts backfired dramatically. And so as a result, when the ballot measure came around, Adam Kingston lost and faced imminent bankruptcy. But as Kingston belatedly discovered, due to a quirk in the way these small New England towns are run, in order for this referendum to come into effect, the results had to be affirmed in what's called a town meeting, essentially a local legislative body with over 200 members. This provided a narrow window of 30 days during which Adam Kingston might be able to persuade the town meeting to adopt a carve-out, altering the referendum to grandfather in pre-existing businesses like Canna Productions. By negotiating carefully with the anti-pot activists and key community leaders, he might just supersede the election that his PR firm had bungled and head off financial ruin. So Kingston brought in a new strategist with more experience in this kind of hyperlocal setting. And together with his team, they assembled a war room where they carefully mapped out, by hand, which town meetings might be supporters, green, opponents, red, or persuadables, yellow. Going around the room, they brainstormed on who on the team might have personal relationships with influential people in town that they could tap to make their case. And in particular, they zeroed in on the local mom behind this grassroots campaign as the key factor in shaping their outcome. Get her on board, and perhaps a deal could be made to avert disaster. So this is where we'll begin our case study, at this crucial moment when Kingston has just 30 days to tap into whatever personal relationships he can uncover in a hyper-local setting to win over the 200-person town meeting, and in particular the grassroots mom activist who just spent the last several months campaigning vigorously to have his business kicked out of town. So without the benefit of social media intelligence, including modern data analytics tools and digital fluency in this campaign, Adam Kingston was forced to rely on interpersonal instinct, the so-called expertise of the outside firm he'd hired, whose approach was largely stuck in the pre-social media era, and ultimately a significant amount of luck in the form of personal relationships as he sought to persuade an activist to change her mind and community leaders to take up his cause. So our goal here is to replace this combination of instinct and luck with data-backed social media intelligence. Specifically, we're developing approaches to better learn about the dynamics on the ground, influence key parties, and then mobilize supporters or neutralize blocking coalitions in an effective way, all on an extremely tight timetable. Now, the key challenge in this work, as anyone attempting it finds very quickly, is that even in a town of just 30,000 people like Old Haven, in today's digital age, there are literally millions of data points available publicly over the internet, haystacks and haystacks of data to sift through. It is immensely difficult to go through and sort out which aspects are relevant or useful to developing strategy and tactics, and not just going to be a distraction to negotiators. So we've borrowed powerful tools from fields like investigative journalism and human rights researchers, originally developed for applications like studying the social media posts from the Syrian civil war to track Russian war crimes. These pioneering techniques form what's called open source intelligence, or OSINT, a discipline that helps identify relevant public data on a faster, more systematized basis. Of course, unlike investigations of chemical weapons attacks or shot down airliners, our approach is very sensitive to privacy concerns, as you can see from the fact we've anonymized most of this case, even though it was widely covered in local media. So using open source research techniques, we've sifted through reams of public data about the town, key community groups, local leaders, and the personal connections and psychographic profiles of opponents, persuadables, and potential supporters alike, providing what could have proved a pivotal edge when it came to learning about all the relevant parties and their interests. As an example of the potential in this work, we're going to take a look first at Adam Kingston's chief counterparty, the local mom activist I mentioned, and explore the ways in which you might learn more about her motivations and values to engage with her more effectively, foster the development of more friendly coalitions, and finally interrupt the formation of hostile coalitions. While this example is a high-stakes corporate situation at a hyperlocal scale, the same techniques we're talking about can be applied proactively to great effect across any manner of negotiation scenarios. So Our main counterparty is a woman who we'll call Debbie Zimmerman. She is a small town suburban mom with a mid-level job in a Boston area biotech firm. From our conversations with Adam Kingston, we know she is steeped in the stigma around marijuana. And you see her here holding a sign that says, "Don't make Old Haven the pot destination." She's worried. She's afraid that the town where her family has lived for generations will be tarnished with the image of potheads, pot dealers, and pot culture. She's a conservative, and she doesn't like the countercultural element associated with marijuana. But at the same time, if you look at the pages she follows on Facebook, well, her main source of health, wellness, and fitness information is this account, who regularly posts content supporting the use of THC in specific medical conditions, or CBD to treat broader health issues like back pain. Then, if you look at her public Instagram account, the yoga studio she likes posts content like this. While at a conscious level, she may be steeped in the stigma around marijuana use, she also exists in this broader culture that you could describe as either pro-cannabis or cannabis adjacent. So if you're looking for a way to engage with Debbie more effectively, you might borrow language, imagery, framing, and arguments from trusted sources like these, which will be much more likely to be met with a positive reception as opposed to the maybe more pro-business arguments you might make elsewhere in town. So another detail that stands out again and again in Mrs. Zimmerman's posts show her concern with the image of the town. That shows up in post after post about pot ruining the town's reputation. But she also volunteers every year at the town's annual cleanup day, which they call Beautification Day. It's an event that brings local media, Girl Scout troops, and nearby businesses to help pick up trash in the area. So as a tactical application of these insights, if Debbie is concerned about the impact that these pot people might have on the town's image, why not have Adam Kingston show up with a couple of trucks and some local employees from his facility and pitch in, volunteer to help clean up the town together? And while at the event, they might even strike up some informal, human-to-human, neighborly conversations. Again, this is just one potential approach among dozens that stand out from our research. So now let's turn to the task of fostering friendly coalitions and take a quick look through the local media channels and Facebook groups. This man you see here on the left, we'll call him Brian Hunt, is a local real estate agent. He's an aspiring conservative politician in the area, and he is very active across many community forums online. His job is building a deep local network, and public real estate records show that he has listed and sold properties in the commercial business district where Adam Kingston's facility is located in Old Haven. What's more, if you look at Brian's Facebook page, you can see that he supports several state-level Republican legislators who have come out in favor of cannabis legalization, either to help treat PTSD for veterans or for the sheer tax benefits. So as a potential target for outreach, Brian might be very receptive to this idea that this anti-cannabis referendum could cast a pall over the commercial viability of Old Haven's business district, where he has a commercial interest. And given his extensive local network, he could be a key outpost for the conservative community in town. While Brian may or may not prove useful, a quick conversation with him could have cleared this up, there is almost no way that the hit or miss methods of the pre-social media age would have been able to identify him as a possible advocate. And here's another tactical application. On the town government's website, all 226 town meeting members are listed, along with their home addresses, which we've blinded here. Now, this obviously raises some significant privacy considerations and makes you wonder why on earth they would publish this information in the first place, but a limited ethical application might be to ask people like Brian Hunt to speak with others who might be persuadable. You can see here a map with green, yellow, and red members, but why not have the green supporters strike up conversations with their yellow neighbors when they run into each other on the block? Now, let's end with some thoughts on interrupting the formation of hostile blocking coalitions. Take a woman we'll call Carolyn Carlton, who you see here speaking on the right. She is a local substance abuse and mental health counselor who partners closely with the police department and the school board on substance abuse issues. Unsurprisingly, she's actively anti-marijuana. On the left is a flyer that she posted to LinkedIn warning about higher THC levels in new strains of weed. But the overwhelming focus of the networking breakfasts you see pictured here is on opioid addiction and recovery. And there has been a massive volume of research about the potential benefits of cannabis use for recovering opioid addicts. Now, these arguments probably aren't going to convince Carolyn to actively support cannabis in her town, but what if Kingston were to embrace this cause and become active in the anti-opioid communities in town? This would be a low-cost action on his part, and he might be able to position Canna Productions as a visible ally of this cause, potentially peeling away some group members or creating divisions within this coalition around a wedge issue like this, so that her anti-drug network doesn't emerge as a key blocking vote with the police department, the school board, and other local leaders. In this way, open source intelligence research might have proved extremely helpful in helping effectively neutralize this key opponent with such strong influence over local leaders. So now that we've walked through a few of these specific examples for how open source data, modern analytic tools, and social media intelligence might have helped Kingston learn, influence, mobilize, and neutralize effectively, what actually happened in Old Haven? Well, in the end, thanks to the heroic efforts from his team and smart instincts from his new strategist, Kingston was able to orchestrate a series of personal introductions, calling in some favors, and eventually land a meeting with a trusted, longtime community leader who agreed to take up his cause and advocate before the town meeting, as well as to arrange a detente between Kingston and Zimmerman. No easy feat and a tense negotiation, to be sure. But ultimately, this approach was successful, and Canna Productions won that carve-out and got grandfathered into Old Haven. Great news, but a nail-biter that easily could have turned out negatively for Kingston. In hindsight, making effective use of social media and OSINT techniques, even at a hyper-local scale under an extremely tight timetable, might have proven pivotal in shaping the outcome of Canna Productions' negotiations with the town. Again, these are just a handful of examples, and there are plenty more we could have spoken about, from an extremely well-connected, well-respected school nurse to dozens of other micro-influencers in town with a potential interest in saving Canna Productions. Armed with the tools and techniques of open source social media intelligence, there is a wealth of untapped, potentially game-changing information available about virtually any negotiation scenario. In fact, when we presented this analysis to Kingston in an interview after the fact, he told us the following.
The primary technique that we used was sort of word of mouth, personal connections, friends of friends, people that had personal connections that could use the telephone to make this outreach. In hindsight, it would be extraordinarily valuable to have a playbook that could be quickly, in a day or two, internalized for how to utilize social media to go and find, to basically go and map the space. And then also to root out and find who we have a finite list of people who are sitting on town meeting. I mean, that would be very easy to basically troll Facebook and listen to what they're saying. And I mean, you know this better than I do. This is what you're doing. But like, as I hear you talking, it's sort of, light bulbs are just going off all around. I mean, people are just giving you this stuff for free. I mean, it's right there. People typically just lay it all out. And so, yeah, I think it would have been extraordinarily valuable. And then it seems like we could have been even more effective at really personalizing communications with folks based on what they've expressed their hopes and dreams and desires are.
So while Kingston was operating within an extremely tight time frame, our research has shown that modern analytical tools, sophisticated OSINT techniques, and a deep understanding of social media intelligence can produce immensely valuable insights within tremendously short turnaround time, virtually anywhere in the world, at almost any scale. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jim for some quick discussion before we open it up to audience Q&A.
Ben, thanks very much. It's a fascinating story. And I'm going to only make one quick remark here, which is in the earlier webinars, we focused on social media's effect on parties that were at a distance from the actual negotiation, but who could still affect it profoundly. Here, I hope you can see that much more directly at the table to learn far more about the people with whom you're dealing, what they care about, what their relationships are, their positions, and all sorts of very useful information as you seek to craft deals, as you seek to persuade and otherwise. And this is a very important piece at the table as well as at a distance. So with that observation, let me turn it over to David, who's going to moderate the discussion itself.
Great. Thank you, Jim. And I thought it's worth mentioning before we start a couple of things. One is that we've picked examples that are in the public domain. We're doing this in the world, but obviously our ability to talk about our advisory engagements is limited by non-disclosure agreements that would probably give away our firstborn children. So what we're able to do is to talk about public examples that illustrate the principles that we hope to show you and expand upon over time. Now, one of the things that we observe in our advisory work is the following. The first time we work with a client, we very often get called in when the negotiation is down the road and screwed up. There's some problems, and they want us to help unscrew those problems. And what we can see is, had we been called in earlier, we would have had many more degrees of freedom to shape the game in which the negotiation is being played and to help them get much better outcomes. And fortunately, our clients understand this and often call us back for the next negotiation at the beginning rather than partway through. And so if we take a look at this negotiation, and Ben, I'm going to turn this question over to you. What would we have done differently or advised Kingston to do differently if we'd been brought in at the beginning, way before this town meeting?
Thanks, David. I think I like that a lot. That's true across all the negotiation work we do, but particularly when it comes to this kind of world of social media that we're talking about. Actually, in the last webinar, we talked a ton about the value of proactivity. And as we were preparing this session, we actually had the chance to interview that second strategist that I mentioned, who ultimately ran the successful campaign. As we were sort of brainstorming with him about some of the uses, one of the things we were talking about is that you might even be able to use something like Facebook to identify people like Brian Hunt ahead of time, and then foster a conversation about the kinds of businesses that Old Haven needs to attract, that will contribute to its tax base, but for example, not add to traffic congestion downtown. And if you had started this early enough, you might even have been able to induce a group like that, a pro-development group in town, to even invite someone like Kingston to the town before he even invested the $10 million in building that facility. That's one example, but I think sort of across the board, wherever you can be, the more proactive you can be, the less you have to rely on that kind of nail-biter combination of instinct and interpersonal skills and luck that we talked about. Thank you. That's a great question.
Okay, good. Second question, again, as we generalize from this, in what other settings might these kinds of tools and approaches be useful? I'll direct that again to Ben.
Sure. Well, like you mentioned, a lot of the cases where we're actually putting this into practice in the real world are confidential. I'll say that it's increasingly sort of a bread and butter use for us. There is always a counterpart, and there is almost always something that we can learn about them. Without going into too much detail, we were advising a client recently, and it turned out that their main counterpart was an avid cyclist. So that was a potentially shared interest that they could use to build some interpersonal rapport. And then we further found out that almost every member of the opposing side's negotiating team was following different executive search firms on LinkedIn. So there could be some principal agent problems there where there's some personal issues or some personal interests that might not have been obvious at the table, but could be very relevant in shaping the outcome. I think there's also been just a ton of research about how you can use things like people's social media profiles to derive really accurate insights about personality traits and things like that. And I think we've talked internally some about some future webinars where we might apply this work to areas like pharmaceutical approvals or large-scale energy projects. And you also, I think you asked a question about tools as well.
Yep.
So I can just make a quick point on that. I know we get a lot of questions about this in this and previous webinars. So I mentioned this earlier, but the kind of analytic methodologies that that we're drawing from are derived from this field called open source intelligence. It was originally developed by people who were human rights researchers looking at things like tracing covert Russian operatives as they moved through Syria, or piecing together Twitter photos of shrapnel from missiles used to shoot down passenger jets in Ukraine. So obviously those people they have a higher mission, so they're less concerned about privacy than we are in this business setting. But we've adapted a lot of the same tools and approaches to use ethically in these kinds of applications. So I can just list a couple. We use relationship mapping tools like Maltego to try to figure out kind of unexpected ties between individuals in a company or between organizations. We have some paid things like SocialNet that are just large databases that help us search through public information. They're free things like check usernames. It's a tool that lets you sort of map cross-platform interactions. And then we've also, I think, done a fair amount of customization, building lightweight scrapers to pull down data from public forums and present those posts in a more analyzable format. But again, all of this is evolving really rapidly. I'm sure my answer would be different 3 months from now because the social media landscape itself changes so quickly, and this is really a swiftly emerging field.
David, if I could add a little bit to this, the question of where this is applicable, the more we get into this, I think it's almost applicable to almost any negotiation. Because what are you traditionally trying to do when you're across the table from someone or several people is you want to understand as best you can about them. So you ask questions, you read body language, you talk to other people with whom they've negotiated, you look at their records, where they were educated, and just a whole bunch of stuff. But when you turn to the social media channels, you can uncover so much more to understand, to put yourself in the other person's shoes. I almost can't think of a negotiation where that isn't highly relevant. The other piece that it helps with immensely is you discover all sorts of relationships and links, formal and informal. And many times, as David was describing the 3D negotiation methodology, we integrate actions at the table with actions away from the table to set up and reset the situation at the table more favorably. And our earlier webinars focused on the ways that social media can help and almost turbocharge actions away from the table, but similarly at the table. So I think this is really important to keep in mind. There's another dimension that I think is emerging, especially for negotiations that may end up having some public aspect, which many do these days. And that's that when someone's moving into a potential controversy that has a public aspect, you better expect that you're going to be subject to attack, if you will, for all sorts of things that may or may not be directly related to this negotiation. Analysts call this your attack surfaces and the areas where you might be vulnerable. And you should know that before you get into what might be a contentious process and figure out how you're going to prevent it or inoculate against it or deal with it way better than after you've been hit with it and blindsided to do something. So I think this is not a specialized tool for particular cases, but it's becoming and should become much more general. It certainly is in our practice.
Yeah. So let me just push that question a little bit, the extension of what you just said, Jim, to Ben, and then we'll pick up some other questions. But Ben, Jim talked about sort of understanding the attack surface. And so the question is, what are the techniques for doing that? And briefly.
Yeah, it's something I would say sort of continually shocked at how few businesses are really prepared. There is both for what's coming in the future and in many cases for what's already here, just hidden. I think virtually any negotiator should expect that this is, if it's not already being used against them, it will be soon. So one of the things we've tried to do is we've borrowed, again, sort of methodologies from areas like national intelligence, cybersecurity, and they have a process called red teaming. So essentially that involves taking someone who's fluent in these areas, having them put on their evil hat for a day and think through all of the creative ways in which they might be able to use this kinds of data research techniques, methodologies to hurt you. And, whether that's derailing an agreement or gaining some kind of unearned advantage in a particularly high stakes deal. And I think it's our expectation that will just become a standard feature of every negotiation that we touch. It's just increasingly inevitable that you're going to have unscrupulous counterparties or even parties completely external to the process, like we explored in our first webinar, who will take advantage of this field.
Okay. So one of the questions we received follows on from that. It's just a minor extension, I think. We should. What do you think the trends will be around the role of social media in negotiations or with company strategy into 2021 or the next 2 or 3 years? I'm assuming it will just become ever more important. I think you would say, yeah, we're seeing it, and we would expect that to continue and expand.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that social media is going away, and I think it's they call it an information revolution, and whenever you have a revolution, there are openings created for any number of people who are early adopters of that to gain an advantage. And I think it's just something that will become more and more ingrained in negotiation strategies as we move forward.
When we started thinking about this, we naturally assumed that all kinds of people would have written useful things about it for practitioners and academics. And it just turned out that there was very, very little that had focused on this piece. Somehow the negotiation applications of social media had been ignored for the most part. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, which I think means that the field will be catching up pretty rapidly. And we found it to be, I don't want to say virgin territory, but relatively unexplored. I think that will change fast.
Yeah. Okay. So, by the way, I just want to mention that 2 of the panelists from our last session, Paul Levy and Isaac Silberberg, are on in audio if someone has questions for them as well. So we can take questions about all 3 sessions here. One question asked, and Jim, I think I'll turn this one over to you, is what are your views on AI-based tools that describe the personality of people based on what they post on social media?
It is almost certain that will turn out to be a source of valuable insight. There are 2 or 3 studies that have now been done that to try to figure out whether the profiles that people post, especially on Facebook, but also elsewhere on Instagram and in other settings, whether those profiles are sort of idealized views of people, very rosy and not that real or useful compared to their underlying personalities, or are they pretty reflective? And it turns out that tools that analyze these kinds of posts when people take personality tests, it turns out that these tools turn out to be quite useful, and that the profiles are quite revealing. And I think AI is going to be figuring out many more ways to do that. But this is, I think, one of those areas that lots more research is going to be done, lots more tools are going to be developed, but I think it's at an early stage.
And if I remember correctly, some of the studies suggest that what you can glean from the public profiles is actually more accurate than going to people's friends to ask them about the personalities of their friends.
Yeah, if you look at there's sort of 5 major personality traits that psychologists use, and if you ask people to rate their friends that way, and then you ask the subjects, if you will, to take the standard tests in that to reveal directly what those traits are, Facebook profile analysis by these techniques we've been describing is more accurate than the people around them often are. So it's it's an interesting and, to me, kind of counterintuitive result.
So next question says, how would you apply this strategy to sales B2B? And I'll start here, and maybe we can join in. But the first thing is you're going to use it to learn what you can about your counterparts, where not only what they care about internally, in terms of in the company, but what their interests are more broadly. You're looking at where do they get their information, who are they linked to, and in many cases, you'll see that the deal has no public interest. That you could post the findings on the deal, and only the 10 people in the industry who are care about this and are competitors would actually care about the details of the deal. But in that case, you're really trying to understand your counterpart and all the other people around him or her in the negotiation. How do they make decisions? And where do they get their information from? I think Ben shared an example. We discovered that somebody was a cyclist in another negotiation that we're advising on. We saw that one of the protagonists has a very extensive social media profile, that he's active in keeping it up, and has said a lot of things positively about his relationship with our client in public forums. And so that turns out to be useful, as we go forward. In some cases, there'll be public interest. For example, one of the things that stimulated the opposition to HQ2, I think, was Amazon's sales to the federal government, facial recognition software to ICE. So if you were in that part advising on that sale, you'd want to be prepared for that. So I think you see all the aspects of this, learning, influencing, mobilizing, and neutralizing as possibilities in sales B2B, depending on the context.
Just a brief addition to those broader points. Often in a business-to-business negotiation, a supplier, for example, and those negotiations, you really want to understand the organization in which they're embedded. And sometimes it's pretty easy to figure out what the formal organization is. But what's often much more relevant is the informal organization. And these tools are pretty good at helping you map that. And that gives you a sense of where you can be most effective in influencing those salespeople.
Okay. So here's somebody who's teaching, says, what concrete skills or OSINT techniques would I need to point my students to such that they can engage in these types of social media intelligence activities?
Sure, I'm happy to take that. I think, the young guy. I think one of the things that I've found, so I mentioned just that there are haystacks and haystacks of data, and there are a variety of different researchers, organizations who have done a lot of really good research about just how you sift through that quickly. I think the one I would recommend most strongly would be Bellingcat. They're a human rights researcher who actually was he was a stay-at-home dad and an Xbox gamer. And he started recognizing these photos from war zones. He recognized the weapons from Xbox and went, oh, wait, that's a Russian weapon. Where does that come from? So that's built and built. They've won a number of awards. But I also think there are, again, Bellingcat publishes, many guides on some of the most advanced tools that are out there today. But there's more so than just the specific tools that you might look at. I think what the sort of framework that we've been developing of learn, influence, mobilize, and neutralize is the kind of thing that's applicable regardless of the specific format, the specific tools, the specific platform that you're looking at. So I think that's a pretty strong, flexible framework to teach.
So now here's a question which says, I'm interested in how this, I think meaning the advent of social media in negotiation, influences the power balance in negotiation. You need time and skills to do this analysis, but doesn't it skew the balance further in favor of the powerful and financially strong party? Now, I'm going to turn this over to Ben in a second, but I will note that actually most of the cases that come out in the public actually are the reverse. They're like Amazon and HQ2, where the weak party has picked these tools because they're not that expensive or difficult as a way to respond to a power imbalance. Now that will probably shift over time, but it isn't necessarily the case that this automatically skews things in favor of the powerful. Ben?
Yes, I actually think if anything, it's the opposite. I think anytime you have a revolution in technology, there is an opening for less powerful parties to adopt those new approaches faster and gain advantages. We've used metaphors like the British in the Revolutionary War, the French behind the Maginot Line. There are all of these, case after case after case where businesses that you would think are digitally savvy, powerful, connected, like Amazon, get just absolutely outclassed. And I think there are some structural elements of social media. It tends to prioritize emotion and strong sort of symbolic tribal gestures over the sort of cold, hard, rational jobs figures, things like that. That I think tends to give advantages to people who are typically not our clients. I would also point to Paul's example, negotiating with the SEIU. Paul had no money. He had no budget. They had a multi-million-dollar organizing budget, and he had a blog. So in that case, Paul was actually able to use the sort of personal vulnerability and availability to gain an influence over that negotiation in a way that that's the exact opposite of the power imbalance.
I think
that's a really good point.
I think what we're seeing is modern day Davids have a digital slingshot to deal with Goliaths. And they tend to be much faster, and Goliaths tend to take a while to work through the internal processes and so forth. And these tools are relatively cheap, and that favors what are currently the weak.
So I'll say one further thing, which is this is going to be a bit of a caricature of big companies, big organizations generally, is where social media folks in the company are located. They will have in the sort of customer relations group a bunch of 23-year-olds whose job is to read reviews and respond by saying, we're really sorry that our product was awful, but that isn't our standard. We strive for excellence except on our products. So they respond with these sort of pro forma answers. And secondly, they use social media to push out and position the brand. But the folks who do social media aren't connected really at a strategic level to the people involved in important negotiations. That's a separate group and they're not really connected. So big organizations will have to change the way they organize this function to actually get the proactive input, get the input and be proactive in negotiations. So I think at the moment, they're at a disadvantage, not an advantage. That can change. Another question. How do you avoid backlash? Jim and Ben, I'll ask you both about this. When people ask you why you're contacting them and figure out that you've been stalking them on social media with the help of outside consultants. One, you do it carefully so that they don't figure it out, but.
You know, I think, so I'd take the example of Adam Kingston. You know, when he went in to talk with this grassroots mom activist, you know, that was in reality, that was a tense, relatively hostile conversation. And, you know, it's not that Kingston goes in and says, well, on Instagram, you liked this, you know, this image of a joint. It's more that Adam might learn from her posts that conversations, you know, that discussion should center around wellness rather than, and, you know, the potential health benefits rather than, you know, the tax base of the town. And then he would have a very different conversation with someone like Brian Hunt. You know, I think I would also then just reiterate the importance of privacy in all of this. And I think that's a crucial reason why, you know, it's inherently important, but it's also important in terms of just instrumentation, that if you're not acting ethically, you will very quickly, I think, find some backlash. And Jim, if you
I also think, I think that it's important to remember that these social media tools and the online piece of this, to be effective, needs to be integrated with the physical part of negotiation. And so if you approached someone because you got a clue from social media that they were interested in this or that, I don't think, you certainly wouldn't be stalking them in the sense of finding people and following them around secretly. You're looking at a profile and then taking cues, which you can then follow up in the real world and have, I think, much more of a natural conversation. But I do think that if, you know, there's so many ways that this stuff can backfire if misused, as it has been in area after area. You know, what I think is important to remember is that we're advocating ways of using social media that strengthens traditional actions that negotiations take in almost any case. You know, learning about their counterparts, trying to persuade them, bringing useful influence to bear, and so forth to get the kind of deals that they want. And without social media, ethical and privacy considerations, you know, are there. You can't hire private detectives, bug somebody's office, bribe an employee to reveal confidential information, dig into garbage. You know, all that stuff, you know, you could do regularly, you know, without social media, and you shouldn't. And appropriately modified strictures like that should apply to social media. So you shouldn't hack, you shouldn't use it to embarrass or blackmail, you shouldn't use bots to spread lies or disinformation or, you know, commit fraud or identity theft. You know, and by the way, there are rules such as the European Union's General Data Protection Regulations for those who would use social media for these purposes. And you really ought to take those into account. Privacy and ethical concerns matter a lot, both the letter and the spirit. And as Ben said, failure to do that, I think, risks the real likelihood of causing harm, reputational damage, undercutting legitimacy, and frankly, backfiring. So I think the concern is very real. But the information is there. We advocate its ethical use.
Okay. So we, two things. We have hit the witching hour. We said we would stop at the end of 30 minutes of questions. I think we're right about there. We have a few other questions, but which are interesting, but I think that, you know, in the interest of credibility, we're going to stop now, and we want to thank you all for joining us. We're finding this to be a very intellectually interesting area and very fruitful in terms of giving advice to companies. So thanks very much for joining us. And Ben and Jim, do you want to sign off?
Just appreciate your joining us, and to underscore how interesting intellectually and practically this new frontier of negotiation actually is. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your questions and the time you spent with us.
Thank you so much, everyone.
And we'd love to hear about interesting cases that you're involved in. And Ben, thank you for such, you know, great analysis and clear description of what we've done, because it's hard to shrink these into 20 minutes of talk.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
All right.
Great.
Thanks very much.
Ciao.